Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, is remembered in history as being the first presumed victim of the serial killer known around the world as Jack the Ripper. A terrible and horrific distinction for any human being. Mary Ann had lived most of her life in South London. By 1888 she was 42 years old, and the last few weeks of her life were spent here in the East End. Here most of her associates were from the class known as unfortunates. Their very name suggests sympathy. Their situation in life was unfortunate. These were women who had fallen on hard times. As harsh as conditions were, particularly for the working class, the Victorian era was noted for its sentimentality, for charity, for putting women on a pedestal. If they fell off, it was unfortunate, and they were unfortunates. The term unfortunate was a synonym for prostitute, and in this context they tended to be at the bottom of the ladder, resorting to roaming the streets at all hours of the day or night looking for custom. They also often earned money by some other means, performing casual cleaning jobs or selling odds and ends. But in extremis, which was often, if they needed some ready cash for alcohol or for a warm bed for the night, they sold themselves. The circumstances that led such women to occupying that place in society reinforced the usage of the term unfortunate. Mary Ann Nichols' case was fairly typical. An unhappy marriage, alcohol, separation from her husband, estrangement from her father and children, a remorseless downward spiral. Her husband accused her of becoming a prostitute, a claim upheld by their parish council, who had looked to him for paying her maintenance. Despite Victorian sentimentality, there was not much of a safety net for those who fell through the gaps in society. Other areas were poorer, and prostitutes frequented many other districts, but Spitalfields had a particular concentration of common lodging houses or doss houses where few questions were asked. She was no doubt drawn there by the anonymity and the prospect of cheap lodgings. The evening of the last night of her life, on Thursday the 30th of August 1888, seems to have largely been spent in the Frying Pan public house here on the corner of Thrall Street and Brick Lane. At closing time she returned to one of her regular haunts, Wilmot's lodging house. After hanging around the kitchen at about 1:30 a.m, the deputy in charge of the premises turned her out as she didn't have the price of a bed for the night, 4 measly pence. On leaving, she put on a show of bravado.
"I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now."
Polly presumably believed that this little black bonnet, which was in all likelihood not entirely new, would be of assistance in enabling her to obtain the fee for her lodgings. For those who doubt that Polly Nichols was engaged in prostitution, at that time of night, what possible business could Polly transact that a new hat would be of assistance in procuring for her the price of her lodgings? To accord with modern sensitivities, it's become fashionable to try and sanitise the grim realities of the lives of the victims of Jack the Ripper by denying, against all evidence, that they were not engaging in prostitution at the point at which they met their tragic ends, as if that detail makes their fate better or worse. Polly left Wilmot's, retraced her steps to Brick Lane, and then walked towards the main road. Brick Lane becomes Osborne Street and then opens up onto Whitechapel High Street. Here, Polly bumped into one of her new friends, Emily Holland, who was described as elderly. Emily had been out gawking at 2 huge fires that had broken out in the docks way down there and lit up the London skyline, one at South Dock and one at Shadwell Basin. The 2 women spoke briefly on this corner outside a grocer's shop, opposite Whitechapel Church, which was blitzed in the last war, so only a churchyard remains and a handful of graves that are still intact. An earlier version of this church gave the district its name, Whitechapel. While they chatted, the church clock struck 2:30 a.m. Emily tried to persuade Polly to accompany her back to Wilmot's. She was the lodging house keeper, and so she outranked the deputy who had turned Polly away. She could, if she chose, offer her a free bed. Pride, no doubt, encouraged by drink and her newish hat, emboldened Polly, and she refused this offer. Polly bragged,
I've had my lodging money 3 times today and I've spent it. It won't be long before I'll be back.
Staggering in a slightly drunk manner, Polly insisted she would soon get more money and be able to stay at the White House, a rival lodging house that allowed mixed couples to share a bed. Another indication, if it be needed, that Polly was looking for a man for money. Polly walked off eastwards. It is now the early morning of Friday the 31st of August, about an hour and a quarter after Emily and Polly had parted company about a mile and a half to the east. A man called Robert Paul hurried down Bucks Row on his way to work in Spitalfields in this direction as a carman, a cart delivery driver. In the dark ahead, he saw a man in front of him, a man standing in the road. The man came towards Robert Paul. Paul nervously tried to avoid him as he regarded this area as one frequented by roughs and where attacks had happened in the past. As Paul swerved around him, the man tapped him on the shoulder and said,
"Come and look over here. There's a woman lying on the pavement."
Sure enough, a little further on the opposite side, a woman was lying on her back. Together they went towards the body, which was close to where the man had been standing. A small black bonnet was lying pathetically in the road by her outstretched arm. The man touched her on the arm and face. Paul did likewise to see if she was warm. Paul also brushed her breast and felt a slight movement, like the breath that a small child might make. Her legs were slightly apart and her dress was raised to her hips. Thinking she was alive but had swooned after being raped, Paul suggested they prop her up. The other man refused, saying,
"I don't want to touch her."
even though he had just touched her. Paul then pulled her dress down to make her decent, but as it was caught up underneath her, he could only pull it down to her knees. The other man assisted, even though he didn't want to touch her. Paul now remembered that he was late, so he made his excuses and left, saying he would tell any policeman that he met on his way to work. The other man agreed, so together they left and walked off westwards towards the city. Past a railway policeman on duty in a gatehouse some 60 yards further on, but they didn't raise the alarm with him. Around the corner they came across PC Jonas Mizen on his beat at the junction of Hanbury Street, Old Montague Street and Baker's Row. Mizen was engaged in knocking up duty. Some residents paid the local police station to detail their local beat policeman to knock them up so they could get to work on time, like an early morning alarm call. The other man approached, and Mizen, who claimed the man, told him,
"You are wanted in Bucks Row by a policeman. A woman is lying there."
When Mizen gave his testimony at the forthcoming inquest, the man was brought forward so Mizen could identify him. Mizen had not taken his name on the morning in question, as he thought he was just a messenger sent by another constable. He now learnt that his name was Cross. Cross testified next, and he claimed he told Mizen,
"She looks to me to be either dead or drunk."
and he claimed that Paul added,
"I think she's dead."
even though Paul had also said that he'd felt a breath, wanted to prop her up and pull her dress down to make her decent. There was no mention of a possible rape, and no mention of a policeman in Bucks Row. The discrepancy between the different versions of this conversation were not greatly inquired into at the inquest. In any event, Mizen finished knocking on the door he was on and went on his way to Bucks Row. While this was going on, another beat policeman, PC Neal, was proceeding down Bucks Row. He noticed a body on the other side of the pavement and went over to it. With the aid of his bullseye lantern, he saw immediately that it was a woman with her throat cut deeply from ear to ear, nearly severing her head. Her eyes were wide open, staring emptily into the night. Fortuitously, at this moment, PC Neal heard his colleague PC Thane walking on his neighbouring beat some 150 yards away to the east down the far end of Bucks Row on Brady Street. Neal signalled Thane with his lamp and Thane came to his assistance. Neal said,
"Run at once for Dr. Llewellyn."
Thane went for Dr. Llewellyn, who lived quite close by on Whitechapel Road, arriving just before 4 a.m. Questions were asked at the forthcoming inquest whether or not Thane had diverted to get his cape from a nearby yard while on his way to fetch Dr. Llewellyn. Thane, of course, denied it. PC Neal then looked west with his lamp and signalled PC Mizen, who was in any case already on his way to give assistance. PC Neal thought he had summoned Mizen with his lamp. Mizen thought he'd been sent to the scene by two messengers sent by Neal. As Mizen was immediately sent to Bethnal Green Police Station to fetch reinforcements and an ambulance, which was actually no more than a hand cart, Neal and Mizen had no opportunities to check these details with each other, and as they were based at different police stations, this misunderstanding persisted for several days, with PC Neal being regarded as the first finder of the body rather than Paul and Cross. As more policemen and casual bystanders arrived to stare, Dr. Llewellyn appeared. He gave a quick examination. Her hands were cold and her arms were still warm. Llewellyn believed she'd been dead for less than half an hour. He gave the following instructions.
"Move the woman to the mortuary. She is dead. I will make a further examination of her."
He then went back to bed. Mizen had by then returned with the ambulance. PC Thane helped to lift the body onto the cart and got blood on his hands. Thane also noticed that a pool of blood had formed where her neck and legs had been. Whitechapel didn't have a purpose-built mortuary, and cases of sudden death had to be taken to the facility used by the Whitechapel Workhouse, which was a slightly ramshackle hut in Pavilion Yard, which was about here, which was owned by the Whitechapel Border Works, just off Old Montague Street, which was fortuitously quite close by. Soon afterwards, Inspector Spratling arrived from Bethnal Green Police Station. He went to the mortuary and found the body was still on the ambulance in the yard. At about 5 a.m, an attendant called Mann arrived from the workhouse. He unlocked the mortuary and the body was brought inside. There, Spratling looked under the dress and noticed that the abdomen had been cut open in several places. Llewellyn was roused out of his bed for the second time to inspect the newly revealed wounds. In his opinion, they were inflicted by a long-bladed knife that had been stabbed into the victim and pulled downwards, creating two long, deep wounds and several smaller ones. Around this time, Mann went for breakfast. Mann came back with another attendant at about 6:30 a.m. and they stripped the body, although there was some confusion over exactly when and why this occurred. Spratling claimed he gave orders for the body not to be touched. Another inspector, Helson, arrived from Bethnal Green at about 8 a.m. According to him, the body was still fully clothed at that time and he witnessed the clothing being removed. When Spratling returned at midday, to his annoyance, he found that the body had been stripped with her clothing literally cut off her, vital evidence being destroyed in the process. One of the first tasks in any murder investigation is to identify the victim. The police suspected she might have been an unfortunate and made inquiries at various lodging houses. A number of women came forward to view the body in the mortuary. Emily Holland was one of the first to identify her as Polly, the only name by which she was known amongst her peer group. Polly was still wearing various items of workhouse issue clothing, which led the police to Lambeth Workhouse. From their records, her true identity as Mary Ann Nichols was established and her estranged family were located. Various newsmen and other potential witnesses were also allowed to view the body in an attempt to trace her last movements. Inevitably, gruesome reports describing the victim and her wounds soon appeared in print. Dr. Llewellyn conducted his official post-mortem the next morning on Saturday the 1st of September, after which the body was placed in a shell, a sort of makeshift lidless coffin. The inquest into Mary Ann Nichols' death convened the same morning under the eye of the coroner, Mr. Winnie Baxter, in a room on the first floor of the Whitechapel Working Lads Institute over the road there. The first task for the jury was to troop down to the mortuary, led by the coroner's officer, a Mr. Banks, to view the body. The witnesses on that first day were Edward Walker, Polly's father, who formally identified the victim for the benefit of the inquest. Then there was PC Neal, who detailed how he'd found the body. As I said, it wasn't realised for several days that Robert Paul and the other man Cross had been there first. And Dr. Llewellyn, who described how he initially saw the body, how he was called back to the mortuary, and the results of the post-mortem. Wynne Baxter then adjourned proceedings until Monday the 3rd of September. After the close, Inspector Aberline tracked down the separated husband, William Nichols, and brought him to the mortuary to confirm the identification. On seeing the body, he shuddered and said,
I forgive you, as you are, for what you have been to me.
When the inquest into the death of Mary Ann Nichols finally concluded on Saturday the 22nd of September 1888, the jury returned a verdict of
Willful murder against some person or persons unknown.
The death certificate was issued on the 25th of September, and the cause of death taken from the post-mortem was given as
violent syncope from loss of blood from wounds in neck and abdomen by some sharp instrument.
Early in the morning of Thursday the 6th of September, Polly's mortal remains were secretly taken from the mortuary and taken to Henry Smith's undertakers at 87 Hanbury Street. Word had already got out and thousands of people were gathering in front of the mortuary's normal entrance via Eagle Yard off Old Montague Street. Instead, the hearse, drawn by 2 horses, had to arrive via a back gate through Pavilion Yard. The undertaker and his men placed the body in a polished elm coffin and returned to their parlour to await the official mourners. Around about here, 3 coaches waited, 1 with the body and 2 for the mourners. Inspector Helson and a squad of constables from Bethnal Green Police Station attempted to keep the crowd back as people flocked around the coffin to catch a glimpse of the inscription on the brass plate, which simply read,
Mary Ann Nichols, aged 42, died August 31st, 1888.
Finally, the mourners arrived. Polly's father, Edward Walker, her estranged husband, William Nichols, and 3 of her children. The cortege left the undertakers, came down Hanbury Street, turned into Baker's Row, and passed the end of White's Row, which leads to Bucks Row, the scene of Polly's demise. Crowds lined the streets with policemen stationed every few yards, and the shutters of windows were closed out of respect. The procession headed for the City London Cemetery on Aldersbrook Road in Manor Park, or Little Ilford, then on the outer eastern fringe of metropolitan London. At the funeral, Polly's eldest son, Edward John Nichols, who had been living with his grandfather, would have nothing to do with his father, no doubt blaming him in some way for his mother's death. She was buried in a public or common grave on the edge of what is now a memorial garden. The City London Cemetery has rather fittingly created this memorial to Mary Ann Nichols. An earlier one was first placed here in 1996. 2 days after Polly's funeral, Annie Chapman's body, another victim of Jack the Ripper, was discovered a few hundred yards up there in that direction on Hanbury Street. Henry Smith, the undertaker, had to fetch another body from the mortuary. Some people suggest that the search for the culprit, the hunt for Jack the Ripper, is no more than a trivial game, a disrespectful charade that mocks the memory of the victims. I disagree. The victims are remembered due to the interest in the mystery. They're individually the most well-known victims of any serial killer, and this has generated interest in their lives. Furthermore, finding the culprit would bring historic closure. Polly is traditionally regarded as what was the first of what is known as the canonical 5, the 5 murders most commonly attributed to Jack the Ripper. There were similar murders before and after, and because the culprit was never caught, we cannot know for sure which victims were murdered by the same person. In a way, restricting attention to the 5 is disrespectful to the other victims. So who did it? hundreds of people have been suggested over the years, most completely fancifully, including some of the more well-known ones such as Sir William Gull or the Duke of Clarence. Others still follow Victorian prejudice and think that the culprit must be found in the registers of the lunatic asylum. As shocking as the murders were then, and remain due to the mystique that attaches to them, the culprit was a serial killer and almost certainly a psychopath. Then it was a new phenomenon. We know quite a lot now. It is surely only through the study of behaviours of homicidal psychopaths that a solution can be found. And one would not expect an overt lunatic or a celebrity to be responsible, to put it mildly. The chilling reality is that psychopaths passed amongst us unknown and unsuspected, apart from to those who know them very well. They seem ordinary. In my opinion, the prime suspect must be the man seen alone with the freshly slain body of Polly Nichols by Robert Paul. He had a disputed conversation with PC Mizen and then appeared late at the inquest in strange circumstances after PC Neal had been thought to have first discovered the body for 3 days. He then withheld his legal identity from the police. He appeared as Charles Cross, but his true name remained hidden for 120 years. His real name was Charles Lechmere. But that is another story. Thank you for watching.